What would you do if your HOA suddenly decided your car was too old for the neighborhood and fined you until you got rid of it? For most people, a homeowners association is just a minor annoyance, an occasional fee, a few rules about mailbox colors, maybe a friendly reminder about lawn maintenance. But for Karen Whitmore, the HOA wasn't just a set of guidelines, it was a weapon. She wielded its power like a badge of honor, patrolling the quiet streets of Willow Ridge as if she were the law. To her, property values were sacred, and any perceived threat, no matter how irrational, had to be dealt with swiftly. She had made it her personal mission to keep the neighborhood pristine, even if it meant bullying homeowners into submission. So when she saw Marcus Reynolds, a black man, pulling into the driveway of a house that had been vacant for months, her alarm bells went off instantly. He wasn't just a new homeowner, he was an intruder in her eyes. It didn't matter that Marcus had legally purchased the house, that he had signed every document, or that he had every right to be there. To Karen, he represented change, the kind of change she wouldn't allow. Before Marcus had even finished unpacking his moving truck, Karen was already filing complaints. She claimed his vehicle was an unauthorized work truck, it wasn't, that his house had the wrong exterior color, it didn't, and that he was causing a disturbance, he was silently unpacking boxes. Within an hour, she had emailed the entire HOA board, warning them about a suspicious new homeowner. But that wasn't enough. Karen wanted Marcus gone. And if the HOA rules weren't enough to do it, she was more than willing to take matters into her own hands. It started with the whispers. Karen knew that filing HOA complaints alone wouldn't be enough to push Marcus Reynolds out of the neighborhood. He hadn't reacted the way she hoped. Most people, when faced with an endless stream of fines and petty violations, eventually gave up, packed their bags, and left. But Marcus? He hadn't so much as flinched. He paid no mind to her ridiculous accusations. He didn't storm into HOA meetings to fight her. He didn't even acknowledge her presence. And that infuriated her. So Karen did what she did best, she rallied the neighborhood against him. She started with the homeowners who had always been eager to gossip, those who clutched their pearls at the first sign of trouble. It was easy. A quiet suggestion here, a concerned look there. I don't know, something about him seems off, she would say, lowering her voice as if she were sharing something scandalous. I saw him walking around late at night. I'm just saying, you never know these days. That was all it took. Within days, Marcus had become the neighborhood's unspoken threat. Then came the 911 calls. At first, Karen made the calls herself, emboldened by the belief that she was the true protector of Willow Ridge. It started small, claims of an unfamiliar man loitering, suspicious vehicle parked too long, just enough to warrant a drive-by from the local police. But when the officers arrived, they found nothing out of the ordinary. Marcus was simply existing. Karen gritted her teeth and changed her approach. She planted the idea in her neighbors' heads, carefully selecting her words to mask her intent. You can never be too careful these days. If you ever feel unsafe, just call it in. Better to be safe than sorry. She knew exactly what she was doing. Soon, the calls started coming from other residents, people who had no real reason to be afraid but had been conditioned to think they should be. The police began showing up to Marcus's home multiple times a week. Once, it was because he had been standing in his own front yard on the phone. Another time, because he had been bringing groceries inside, and someone thought he looked out of place. The worst was when a neighbor called claiming he was lurking around the side of his own house, when in reality, he was fixing a leak in his sprinkler system. Each time, Marcus remained calm. He knew better than to show frustration, to give them any reason to escalate the situation. He greeted the officers with quiet patience, offering identification without argument, explaining, again and again and again, that he lived there. Karen watched all of this unfold with smug satisfaction. But it still wasn't enough. One night, she decided to go even further. After dark, she walked over to her own car with a small key in her hand and dragged it along the side of the paint, leaving a deep scratch. Then, she knocked over her mailbox, snapping it from its post so that it lay in the street. She took meticulously staged photos, making sure the damage looked dramatic. Finally, she called the police. By the time the officers arrived, Karen was in full performance mode, tears in her eyes, voice shaking, her hands wringing together in feigned distress. It was him, she insisted. I saw him from my window, lurking, and then I heard the scraping sound. When I came outside, she motioned toward her vandalized car, the toppled mailbox. This is what I found. It was the perfect crime. No witnesses. No security cameras. Just her word against his. Minutes later, the police were knocking on Marcus's door. He had been in bed, reading, when he heard the loud banging. By the time he opened the door, a flashlight was already shining in his face. "Sir, we received a report that you were seen damaging property down the street," one officer said, firm but cautious. Marcus's expression didn't change. He had heard this tone before. The "you know how this goes" tone. The "just cooperate and it'll be easier for everyone" tone. His voice was level. "I haven't left my house all night. Would you mind answering a few questions?" Marcus knew his rights, but he also knew that refusing would only make things worse. "Of course," he said, stepping outside. As Karen watched from her porch, arms crossed, she felt a sense of triumph. This was it. This was the moment he would finally see that he didn't belong here. Except, she made one mistake. A voice cut through the night air. "Hey, hold on a second," someone called from across the street. A neighbor stepped forward, holding up their phone. "I think you might want to see this," they said, pressing play on a video recorded from their doorbell camera. And just like that, Karen's perfect crime fell apart. The tension in the night air was thick as the neighbor's phone screen glowed, the grainy footage playing in real time. The officers leaned in, their brows furrowing as the truth unraveled right in front of them. There, in black and white, was Karen, alone, in her own driveway, deliberately dragging a key along the side of her car. The timestamp was clear. Marcus had never even left his house. Karen's stomach dropped. She had been so certain she would get away with it. One officer exhaled, long and slow, rubbing his temple as he turned toward Marcus. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience." Karen felt the shift immediately. The power she had wielded so effortlessly, the ability to snap her fingers and summon authority against someone she didn't want in her neighborhood, was crumbling before her very eyes. She had been caught. But still, she wasn't ready to back down. As the officers turned to confront her, Karen did what she did best, she doubled down. She marched across the street, past the flashing red and blue lights, past Marcus, who stood in stony silence, past the neighbor who had exposed her, her heels clicking with determination. "You don't understand," she snapped, her voice rising. "He's been intimidating me since the day he moved in. He's been watching me, lurking, making me feel unsafe in my own home. I was just trying to protect myself. You can't possibly trust a video over what I'm telling you." Karen didn't realize how ridiculous she sounded. One officer, clearly fed up, crossed his arms. "So you vandalized your own car and mailbox to protect yourself?" Karen's lips parted, then snapped shut. For the first time that night, she had nothing to say. Marcus had remained silent through it all, watching as the scene unfolded around him. But now, he spoke. "I think we're done here," he said calmly. His voice wasn't angry, it was controlled, firm, measured. He had spent years mastering that tone, understanding that any hint of frustration would be weaponized against him. "I've had enough for one night." Karen felt her control slipping. She could already hear the whispers from the neighbors who had come outside to watch. The ones who had once sided with her, believing her every word, were now staring at her differently. She was losing. And that was unacceptable. Desperate, Karen did something she would regret more than anything else that night. As Marcus turned to go back inside, she lunged forward and snatched something off the hood of his car. His keys. No, not just his keys. His badge. For a split second, she didn't realize what she had done. She had only meant to grab something, anything, to regain control, to prove that she had the upper hand, that she still held power over him in some way. But as she closed her fingers around the smooth leather case and looked down, her heart stopped. Police identification. The letters practically burned into her retinas. Marcus turned back slowly, his eyes dropping to her clenched fist. His expression didn't change, but something in the air did. The officers noticed immediately. For a long, terrible moment, no one spoke. Then, "Ma'am, I need you to hand that over. Now." Karen's entire body locked up. She hadn't known. She really, truly hadn't known. Because to her, Marcus had never been a person. He had been a problem. Her throat closed up as the realization crashed over her like a tidal wave. She had just stolen a police officer's badge. Marcus wasn't just some nobody. He was Chief Marcus Reynolds. And she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Karen's fingers trembled as she clutched the badge, her mind scrambling for an excuse, an explanation, anything that could reverse the disaster she had just walked into. But there was nothing. The weight of what she had done pressed down on her like an avalanche, suffocating, irreversible. The commanding officer, Sergeant Carter, took a step forward, his hand hovering near his holster, not as a threat, but as a warning. "Ma'am," he said, his voice clipped, controlled, "I need you to hand that badge over. Right now." Karen's mouth opened, then closed. Her tongue felt heavy, her throat dry. She knew there was no way out of this. But that didn't stop her from trying. I didn't know," she stammered, her eyes darting between the officers, searching for even a sliver of sympathy. "I didn't realize it was his. I thought it was just his wallet. I wasn't stealing, I was just trying to what?" Carter cut her off, his patience thinning. His eyes were sharp now, cold with authority. "To make a point? To prove something?" Karen's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. She could feel the eyes of the entire neighborhood on her now. People had gathered on porches, peering through curtains, watching her fall apart in real time. The power she had wielded so recklessly, her ability to manipulate situations, to twist reality in her favor, to weaponize fear and authority against those she saw as lesser, was crumbling right in front of her. And the worst part? There was no one left to defend her. Marcus hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. He simply stood there, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But Karen could feel his victory. The realization made her snap. "This isn't fair," she shrieked, her voice shrill, cracking under the weight of her own desperation. She whirled on Marcus, her face contorted with rage. This is your fault. You don't belong here. You've been making me feel unsafe. And now you're standing there, acting like some victim." Carter raised a hand, cutting her off. His voice turned icy. "You're done." Karen blinked. "What?" "You're done," he repeated. "I've seen enough." He nodded toward one of the officers. "Cuff her." Karen staggered back. No. No, no, and no. You can't arrest me." But she didn't have a choice. Before she could scramble for another excuse, another lie, another tearful plea, the officer took firm hold of her wrists, twisting them behind her back, the cold metal of the handcuffs clicking into place. The murmurs from the gathered neighbors grew louder, disbelief rippling through the crowd. Karen, the self-proclaimed guardian of the neighborhood, the enforcer, the HOA queen, was now standing in the middle of the street in handcuffs. And for the first time in her life, she was powerless. Marcus finally spoke. His voice was measured, unwavering. "I could press charges," he said, locking eyes with her. "For theft. For harassment. For filing false police reports. For making my life hell since the moment I moved in." Karen's face went pale. "Please," she whispered, her bravado evaporating. I didn't mean to." "You did." Marcus didn't look away. "Every step of the way, you meant to." Silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of every action she had taken, every cruel lie she had told, every moment she had felt untouchable. And now? She wasn't untouchable anymore. Marcus exhaled slowly. "But I won't." Karen's eyes widened in shock. "What?" "I won't press charges," Marcus said. The officers exchanged glances, waiting. Karen could hardly breathe. She was getting away with it? After everything? For a fleeting moment, relief crashed over her, until she saw the way Marcus was looking at her. Like she wasn't worth his time. Like she was nothing. It was worse than anger, worse than hate. Because he had taken away the one thing she had always craved, control. And he had done it without lifting a finger. The officers hesitated, then uncuffed her, stepping back. "You're lucky," one muttered. Karen couldn't even bring herself to thank them. Because as she looked around at the neighbors, the ones who had once followed her orders, who had whispered alongside her, who had nodded in agreement at her complaints, she saw the truth in their faces. She had lost. Not just tonight. But for good. The days that followed were nothing short of a reckoning for Karen. The news of what had happened spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, whispered from doorstep to doorstep, flooding local social media pages. The woman who had once controlled the HOA with an iron grip, who had dictated everything from acceptable porch decor to grass height, was now the subject of hushed conversations and disapproving stares. The HOA board, previously complicit in her tactics, had no choice but to act. An emergency meeting was called, one that Karen hadn't orchestrated for the first time in years. She sat stiffly in the same chair she had once lorded over others from, listening as they listed her abuses of power, the targeted harassment, the false complaints, the 911 calls that had wasted police resources, the stolen badge. By the time the vote was cast, Karen was no longer the HOA president. She wasn't even on the board. The neighbors who had once sided with her, whether out of fear or shared prejudice, had turned their backs. Some, in their own quiet ways, even apologized to Marcus, though he never sought their approval. He didn't need it. He had always belonged there, they were just finally seeing it. But Marcus wasn't one to let an opportunity for change slip away. Instead of celebrating Karen's downfall, he turned his attention to what really mattered, the future of the neighborhood. He organized a community meeting, one that wasn't about rules or fines, but about understanding, accountability, and healing. And Karen, still reeling from the humiliation of her public fall, received an invitation. She almost didn't go. But something made her show up. Sitting before the people she had once controlled, she did something she had never done before. She admitted she was wrong. "I let my fears and biases dictate my actions," she confessed, her voice shaking. "I thought I was protecting this neighborhood, but really, I was only dividing it." The room was silent, not in judgment, but in something Karen wasn't used to, expectation. Marcus, watching her closely, finally spoke. "We all have blind spots," he said. "But the question is, what do we do once we see them?" The discussion that followed wasn't perfect. Change wasn't immediate. But it was a start. Karen had lost everything she had once valued: power, control, blind loyalty. But in that loss, she had been forced to confront the truth about herself. Whether she would truly change, only time would tell. As for the neighborhood, it was finally becoming a community. Have you ever dealt with a Karen or an HOA that abused their power? How did you handle it? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.